Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ned Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this discussion and to welcome Matt Perrault to this discussion about law enforcement and surveillance in the social media era. Let me briefly introduce Matt Perrault to you, and then we're going to have a little bit of a dialogue, and most of the time we're just going to open it up to you all to ask questions. So Matt's the head of global policy development at Facebook, where he helps to develop the company's positions on global public policy issues. Matt also serves as head of policy at WhatsApp. Prior to his arrival at Facebook, Matt was counsel to Congressional Oversight Panel, and he had previously worked at the World Bank and had been a law clerk for the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Matt holds a law degree from Harvard Law School and a master's in public policy from Duke, and an undergraduate degree from Brown University. Class of 2002, so welcome back.
Thanks. It's great to be back.
Let me just say, it's such a privilege for me, being a member of this community, to meet people like Matt when we have alums come back and educate us. It's really appreciated. So what we're going to do is, as I said, we're just going to do a little bit of a dialogue. I'm going to ask Matt a couple of questions just to get us rolling, and then I'll open it up to you all. So let me just start with the first question. You were at Facebook, Matt, when Edward Snowden kind of made his revelations in 2013 and all the discussion of PRISM and government surveillance. And I just want to get a sense from you of what was it like being at Facebook when those revelations were made? What did it mean for you, for the company, and for the industry?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Thank you for having me here. Thank you to the community for organizing a really nice afternoon. It really is like an incredibly special treat to come back to an institution that was so generous to you as an undergrad and to participate in this set of events today. Keith Brown, who's a professor at Watson, was one of my really my main mentor when I was here, and he moderated a panel with students earlier today, and it really is just an incredible treat to be able to do that type of thing with people who have meant so much to you. I stopped, of course, at 4 East Street, which is also the name of my fantasy football league, to see the house that I stayed in senior year that was meaningful, and I ran by the basketball court where I missed an enormous number of layups during the spring of 2002 to take a look at that. So it's been a really special day, and thank you again for having me here. So I've been thinking a lot about Snowden in the last couple of weeks since the story broke about Yahoo's alleged response to a FISA request a couple of weeks ago, because you could see this glimmer in people's eyes for people who had lived through the Snowden experience that was sort of akin to the look that I see in my parents' face when they, so they were semi-hippies in the 60s, and when they have opportunities to protest, you can always see them thinking about, oh, this is kind of like Vietnam. It's going to be really cool to get out in the streets again. And you sort of had this, I sort of had this feeling looking at some of my colleagues' faces when the Yahoo story broke of putting the Snowden band back together, and the people who had lived through that experience, thinking about how to respond as an industry again. And I was actually struck by, it seemed like in some ways in terms of a specific response, how little we've learned. So I was sort of looking at, I taught a class at Duke, I guess about a year and a half ago, and started the first class by talking through the Snowden experience and sort of tried to put students in the position of, type of position that I was in on June 6th, June 7th, 2013, when I was standing in the San Francisco airport and we were on a conference call and someone said, we've been briefed by the Washington Post that the story is going to hit tomorrow. What do we do? And so I've been thinking about that because, so for this Duke course, when I was trying to like push students toward thinking about how we might respond, there were a set of questions that I thought were important to ask based on living through that experience in 2013, such as, did the allegation actually happen, right? So the allegation in the Washington Post when the Snowden story broke was that tech companies like Facebook and Google and Microsoft had direct connections to the NSA. Our servers were directly linked to the NSA, which was an allegation that that turned out to be false. So the first thing was figuring out as an industry whether this thing that was actually alleged had actually happened. I think people forget that there was that delta between what was alleged in the paper and what had actually occurred. That's actually continues to be an ongoing business issue for us, because if you talk to people in Europe and you ask them, is it accurate that companies like Facebook have direct server connections with the NSA, I think you probably, I'm not sure exactly what the numbers are, but I think the numbers are probably very high, and that people still have that belief. So the first thing is like, did the thing actually happen? The second is trying to figure out, well, what's actually the law that applied? So when the story broke about Yahoo, there was still a lot of uncertainty around the exact legal instrument that had authorized the potential request that was at issue, and people were sort of going back and forth talking about what that instrument might be, with obviously like significant ramifications in terms of thinking about what that would mean in terms of trying to evaluate Yahoo's behavior, and there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty at the time. And then I think the sort of last piece is, well, how do you think about it as an industry? Like, what are the sets of things that you champion as an industry in response to these sorts of allegations? And at Facebook, I think, so if the allegations hit in June, and I think by like the late fall, early winter of 2013, we were in a process of working with other tech companies on a set of principles that would govern how we would advocate for surveillance reform. So this eventually became the Reform Government Surveillance Coalition, which has a set of 5 principles that we used as the basis for how we would advocate with governments for narrower surveillance practices that we think were more consistent with international norms. Those included transparency. They included no bulk collection of internet content, avoiding conflicts of laws. And so you're already starting to see, in response to the Yahoo case from a couple of weeks ago, the same type of thing. So Yahoo called today in a letter to the intelligence community, asking the government to be more transparent about its practices, in part so that we can address some of the uncertainty around what actually happened. So again, trying to understand exactly what is true from the newspaper allegations. So it's interesting to me to see, in some ways, how much we've learned, but also how much, with a sort of similar type of incident, we're repeating some of the same dynamics that I think were problematic when this happened in 2013.
Cool. Let me ask a question that will probably reveal my very substantial technological ignorance and regulatory ignorance. So for a company in your industry, you don't have to speak specifically, obviously, about Facebook, but if you receive a FISA national security letter, and presumably you have to comply in some sense and provide access. But if, on the other hand, you, this company, provide your customer with end-to-end encryption, doesn't the end-to-end encryption just kind of obviate the FISA request? In other words, if there's strong end-to-end encryption, it's kind of out of your hands, right?
Well, so it depends on the particular request and the particular information that is being sought. So I won't speak to FISA in particular, but in response to any government any request that we get from any government, U.S. or foreign, we are only able to comply to the extent that we have information and in terms of being able to actually respond. Even if we were legally permitted to or legally obligated to, we can only respond with data if we have the data. And so in a world of end-to-end encryption, there are limits on the data that's available. So I'm not sure how familiar people in the audience are with end-to-end encryption, but basically the idea is that if you and I are messaging with each other, there's no intermediary who can see the content of those messages. So if that's Facebook sitting in between the two of us, or it's WhatsApp sitting in between the two of us, those messages are getting passed through directly. So someone could take my device, and if they had access to the password on my device, they could see the content of those messages, but there's no intermediary who can get in between us. There are, even for products that are end-to-end, there is some information that is available that could be presented by a company in response to a law enforcement request. Typically, so it's referred to as metadata, and it would be stuff like who the subscriber is, and you can even get information sometimes like at what point you communicated and with whom you communicated, but the actual content.
Maybe location of where you were.
Yeah, depending on how the on what the company actually stores. So one of the common misperceptions, for instance, about WhatsApp actually is that people think that data is not available only because of end-to-end encryption, and content's not available in part because of end-to-end encryption, but it's also not available because the service doesn't store messages. So a messaging service is very different than a social network platform. A social network platform is we host content and we host it to be available for the world to see. So there has to be data storage in order to provide the service that we are looking to provide people with. In order for you to use Facebook the way you want to use Facebook, we have to store data in order to make that available to you. For a messaging services, that's not necessarily the case. So WhatsApp made the decision, I mean, I think at birth effectively, to not store data. And the purpose of that was in part to be able to offer a messaging service that worked very quickly. So there's not a lot of back end work to send your messages, and as a result, that means in a place like the World Cup in Brazil, for instance, one of my colleagues said to me that no messaging services were working in soccer stadiums in Rio, but WhatsApp messages were flying around the stadium, and that's not because there are lots of. That's not because of something that in some ways that's necessarily particularly sophisticated about the product. It's because it's very lean and it's not storing messages. So even in the absence of end-to-end encryption, WhatsApp is unable to surface the content of messages in many circumstances because it's not storing them.
So along those lines, from sort of an industry perspective, how do companies think about balancing, I guess on the one hand, the idea that, even cyberspace should be regulated to some extent, like, I don't know, against child pornography, child pornographers or whatever, and that maybe there should be some backdoor, some way to access it, versus just the idea that, no, this is a space that there really should be full encryption and any government shouldn't be messing around in there.
Yeah, so I think we want to ideally have the freedom so that engineers in California who are thinking about building the product that would benefit people as much as possible are able to do that freely. So there are some services where end-to-end encryption might be something that you would want to offer, and that could be protection against intermediaries who would sit in between us. It could be protection against hackers. There are other services where you actually want to be able to deliver a service that's not end-to-end encryption. So Facebook Messenger, for instance, now is increasingly using different types of bots to deliver services to people. So like you can request an Uber, for instance, through Facebook Messenger. You wouldn't be able to do that if Facebook Messenger were offered end-to-end. And so we ideally want to see companies be able to release a set of services that can serve a bunch of different user needs, and then users can choose the platform that they want based on the set of services that's available to them. And in some circumstances, you could have services compete on security. So Telegram and WhatsApp, for instance, I think each respective company believes that they compete on security to offer the best security product to consumers, and then consumers can make choices about what product they want to use. And if they're worried that their service is not secure and that that's going to make it vulnerable to hackers, then they don't have to use it. I think our view would be that we'd rather have those decisions be made by companies than have the government decide what security offerings are available to people. And I actually think the way the encryption debate has played out has demonstrated to some extent the value of this. Like, I think increasingly governments are recognizing not just that they have to deal with a world where companies are making these decisions, but that there are actually benefits from their perspective to having companies make these decisions. So just at the same time that there was chatter in the administration about whether they would come out with a policy requiring companies to provide a backdoor, the Defense Department was simultaneously putting out a request for proposals for secure messaging systems that included end-to-end encryption. And so I think increasingly governments are seeing that the trade-off is not just security versus privacy, but if they want a world with maximum security, that means protecting critical infrastructure against hackers. That means security vulnerabilities and high priority communications, including your relationship you might have with a bank, for instance, that a world where there's end-to-end is actually a good thing.
We'll circle back to the government side of this in a moment, but I want to ask sort of a related question from the consumer's perspective. I like the idea that you put forward of, look, there are different kinds of services we're looking for, and some maybe we want a lot of privacy and security, others not so much. But I think of just the way I use, and I know I'm too old and everything, but the way I use some kinds of social media platforms. And I know in my head that yes, I'm a customer of these platforms, but I'm also the product in a way. I'm walking around with a sensor in my pocket, my phone, and it's generating a whole bunch of data, and I'm giving those data to somebody, and I'm getting some service in return. So like every morning when I commute, I use Waze, and it's awesome because I don't get into bad traffic jams, and I don't get speeding tickets.
Yeah.
And, not that I would ever speed, but, and I don't think that much about it. I mean,
Yeah.
I know that now a company has data about everywhere I go. I don't really worry too much about that.
Yeah.
I kind of assume that that company is not giving my insurer, say, data about the speed at which I'm driving, my driving habits.
Yeah.
I'm kind of assuming that, but I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
And I don't worry too much about it, but it seems like there's a lot of responsibility on the part of the company to decide how to use me as a product.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm partly asking that question because then there are other times when, I don't know, maybe I'm on Facebook and an ad will pop up
Yeah.
that makes me uncomfortable. Like
Huh.
maybe, I don't know, maybe
Does
it's
that,
for,
does that happen? I'm curious.
well, maybe it's not even Facebook, but maybe it's,
But
maybe I've gone to, for example,
yeah,
maybe
yeah,
I've gone
yeah.
to WebMD or something.
Right.
And I've looked up some symptoms for an illness, and now I'm getting drug ads or something like
Yeah.
that, or something that feels to me like, whoa, that's a little bit private. Is my medical insurer finding out about this?
Yeah.
Is like maybe it's an embarrassing condition. So where does privacy, and we'll come to surveillance in a moment,
Yeah.
but where does that reasonable switch that I'm willing to participate in, I'm the customer and I'm the product, no problem, but where are the limits to that? And,
Yeah.
and how does a company think
So I'm
about
actually
that?
curious, just for the sake of discussion, so what are companies where consumers not the product? Just sort of curious. Like,
Yeah, it's not-
like
it's
your
not
cable, like your TV cable
Yeah.
company, you're the product. I don't know, if you, like, where are you, what is a thing that, I mean, and that's like a phrase that's thrown around. I'm sort
Yeah.
of curious, what are the businesses where you're
I
not
think
the product?
what's
consumer-facing
the
business.
point isn't, you're right to
Yeah.
push back
Yeah,
in a
no,
way,
it's true, yeah.
because I watch TV, I'm the product, they're selling advertising to me.
Yeah.
The thing that's so, I think, different about social media is the TV doesn't know everything about my preferences, but
Mhm.
Facebook has a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
Facebook knows, or
Yeah.
say Google,
Yeah.
knows what I'm searching, Facebook knows kind of who my circle of friends are,
Yeah.
knows my preferences, maybe I like something, and
Yeah.
so there's a lot of information that,
Yeah.
and Waze, Google, whatever, knows everywhere I'm going, but voluntarily on my part. So the fact that I'm a product's not just that I'm passively watching the product, I'm transmitting tremendous amounts of data about
Yeah.
who I am, who
Yeah.
I hang out
You also
with.
have a clear, you also have a clear, the fact that you're articulating it in the social media context, but maybe not in certain other contexts where you're moving through the world, I think in some ways means we do a good job of being transparent about what our business model is and about how people interface with it. So I run effectively like a policy planning office at Facebook, and I don't focus on privacy and telecoms issues, those are other teams. So our privacy team is primarily the team that works on advertising type issues and the way that we think about data and stuff. I guess I would say, like, when you said, well, on Facebook, what if I get a crappy ad? And I said, well, what's the crappy ad you got? And you said, well, not Facebook, WebMD. I actually think that means maybe we're doing a good job. Like, that if your experience on Facebook is that you don't receive crappy ads, but you actually receive ads that are relevant to you, our sense is that there's consumer value in that. People don't want to receive shitty ads. And if you're if you're sitting in front of the TV and you're watching TV, it's more likely that you're going to get ads that aren't relevant to you, and that it's actually a good thing to provide people with targeted ads. I think it's certainly the case that we don't want to like hide the ball on what our practices are, and I don't think that we do. I think we're actually pretty transparent about it. I sort of have thought about this sort of interesting dilemma. So if you think about Mark Zuckerberg in his Harvard dorm room in 2004, and he's got a choice, and the choice is, so he's going to release this. So he's going to put this product out into the world, and he has a very specific choice available to him, which is, do I build in privacy settings, or do I not? And if you look at the set of companies that existed in 2004, like if you think about your experience browsing the internet, or you think about your experience watching TV, you didn't really have that many privacy settings available to you. You have more now, but I think there's a really strong argument to be made that we provide more robust privacy settings than most others, if not any others. We really are focused on giving people control over their information. And I think he made the decision to include privacy settings because he realized that for a social network whose mission was to make the world more open and connected, to give people the power to share, that people would not share if they felt like their information was really vulnerable. And that means vulnerable to advertisers, vulnerable to hackers. If it was just going to go out in the world and they would have no control over it, that would not be a successful business. So he included privacy settings. I think there is a dynamic where when you put something out for people to criticize, they don't say, your privacy settings are awesome. You're a leader across, in terms of any consumer-facing tech company, you guys are a leader because you provide privacy settings. Instead they say, look at those settings. They're so shitty. They should be better in all these different ways. And I think that's actually like in some ways that's a really healthy dynamic, right? Like it's good if we put something out in the world and people tell us why it sucks and then we make it better, or people tell us why it's 80% of the way to excellent and we try to journey that remaining 20%. But I think it's sort of arguable that like the reason that we have been criticized in particular early on about privacy issues is because we put something out there for people to criticize.
Right, but just to be clear, the concern I expressed wasn't that the ads are irrelevant to me, they're just too relevant. So,
Yeah.
you know, so my vices, at least the ones I'll discuss, are kind of maybe I'm going to Amazon and buying and constantly searching for
Yeah.
running shoes, and
Yeah.
then I'm getting, maybe I'm a compulsive buyer of running
Yeah.
shoes, but then I'm constantly getting these ads for more and more running shoes.
Yeah.
So running shoes obviously not a problem, but there are other things that maybe you
Yeah.
really wouldn't want to be constantly,
Right.
or that being barraged by them suggests, wow, somebody really knows something so specific about me that
Yeah.
is tailored in a way that's making me uncomfortable.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there are a bunch of different things that could be. You can imagine like there are lots of sensitive spaces, like health, for instance,
Right.
and other things where you can imagine ads that would like
Behavioral spaces,
yeah, that would feel
driving,
feel
health.
inappropriate or create real world harm. And I'm not sure that our practices sort of deliver ads that have that feeling or that that raise those risks. And I think it's sort of interesting to me the way privacy regulation. There's sort of a set of different things that you could focus on. You could focus on data collection. Just does it make us uncomfortable that companies have this information? And then you could focus on use of that information for harm. And it makes more sense that we would try to prevent the latter from happening than the former. Although again,
Yeah.
I think we're like pretty transparent about what we do, and I think we're pretty responsive to user concerns about it. And I think like the way that people use our service tends to, I think, reflect them being comfortable generally with the way that we approach our data practices.
So on the issue of uses of the data, but then circling back a little bit to
Yeah.
surveillance, in the Washington Post, a couple of days ago, maybe a week ago, there was a story that ran about this company, Geophedia,
Yeah.
which, again, I'm going to express my ignorance about the technology, but at
Yeah.
least the story as I understood it was that a series of social media companies, firms,
Yeah.
were providing data streams to a third-party company, totally
Yeah.
normal, customers, product, blah, blah, blah. So and then this company is selling those data as part of an analytical product to
Right.
surveillance agents, to police forces.
Right, right.
And then police forces, whether in Ferguson or Baltimore, were the two
Yeah.
places mentioned, were using those metadata, I assume, about location,
Right.
to assess protests.
Yeah.
And to connect protests to individuals or groups of people who might be, and that's where now we go from lots of data being voluntarily given up by the consumer for good reason,
Yeah.
like social media, to the company then monetizing that for something that gets turned into a surveillance.
Yeah, so I would be clear about a couple of different aspects of it. So first of all, the data that was at issue in this case was public data. So I think there are like a set of best practices for people in the world where we have the internet that we have, and one of them is like think of public data as being public. And if you have concerns about data being used for different purposes in a public sense, then don't share it in a public way. And again, we have controls that make it possible for people to narrow the audiences with whom they share information, and people should use those. Like the reason we have them is because we hope that people will use them. That company, we actually shut down that usage, and we shut it down because it was operating in a way that wasn't consistent with our policies. You can't take public information out of Facebook and then use that to create an industry where you're selling it to lots of different entities, including law enforcement. So we shut down that usage. I guess the other thing that I would say is like we also, it's also important that the body of law that exists to protect against certain practices does protect against certain practices to the extent that there are police agencies who are using data in a way that's contrary to law. Like that, it would be something that would be of concern as well. It's not. I don't think of that as really being a Facebook issue, but I think that that's a dynamic that's important here.
Yeah, and I'm in some ways hesitant to raise that particular example because it's partly about Facebook.
Yeah.
But if we step back from that to general industry
Yeah.
thing, I'm uncomfortable with the idea of saying, and you didn't quite say this, but
Yeah.
I'm uncomfortable with the idea of saying, look, you know, we give the user a bunch of options,
Yeah.
privacy options, and you know, we also ask the user to sign an agreement,
Mhm.
you know, maybe a zillion pages long,
Yeah.
and some people just, I check them off without reading them, and I somehow feel it's not quite enough of an answer to the ordinary citizen to say, well, you had the opportunity to opt out, but
Yeah.
instead you're using Waze, and you've given up your data, and now sort of it's fair game. You didn't say fair
Yeah.
game, but I guess I'm asking, how does a company think about the right boundary? Like the GeoFedia, whatever thing was shut down, but it originally happened that
Yeah.
these data were provided, and I could think of a lot of very gray area uses for these data that I've given up that, yes, I agreed to it, but did I really, as a customer, agree to this stuff being given to
Yeah.
a surveillance agency or a
Well,
or
so we
even
wouldn't
a-
give the data to us, like, we have strong procedures
But I mean, in
that
an
govern.
industry, how does one think
Well,
about
so I
it?
guess what's the alternative? I guess that's one question I have. So like, what's the different, so in other words, one thing that I hear you saying is, you're putting a lot of burden on the user, and is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah.
And I guess there is, to some extent, I understand the concern, but if you're moving away from the concern, you're moving toward a more paternalistic world where you're cutting off opportunities for innovation or opportunities for certain types of products because, not because you believe that the majority or the overwhelming majority of use cases are problematic, but because you see some potential for harm. And I guess like with lots of products, people
Yeah.
can use them in ways, there are lots of bad actors in the world. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say,
Yeah.
but I think that's not quite what I'm getting at.
Okay.
So I have an interest in using these platforms.
Yeah.
Because I definitely benefit, there's no doubt about it, and
Right.
it's free, which is maybe the problem, but at least for now, I think it's awesome that these platforms are free. A number of the providers, it's not just whether they're good guys or bad guys, but they have a monetary benefit, there's a financial benefit to my not making that data private. You know, to the extent I don't check off all the privacy options, it provides more leeway for at least some of these social media platforms to
Yeah.
to use the data, to monetize the data.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure that's
No.
true. I'm not sure we're just like pushing for more public and more public and more public. I mean, we can serve ads based
Yeah.
on other, the only way to serve ads is not based on how public it is. And I'm also just not sure about the assumption that like, the idea of doing crappy things with your data, so the heart of the Snowden accusation, which is, we have a front door open to consumers, and then out the back, we open this little thing, and we allowed the NSA to plug in, and the NSA just sucks away data. That's problematic for us, not because like it's bad Washington Post headline, it's problematic for us because it really hurts the business. People don't trust us, we're not gonna be able to have a viable, the business in the way that we wanna be able to have a business. So if you're a sharing service and your focus is on trying to give people an ability to share information, if people don't trust that service, they're not gonna share information. So it's really important that the way that we set up our practices with advertising, with respect to privacy controls, with respect to our law enforcement practices, that those are set up in a way that build trust. So you can look at that in a couple of different ways. Like I think you can look at it in terms of like the numerous stories in the media on a daily basis about how crappy we are in different ways, right? And that kind of happens on a daily basis. I'm not sure and we are like responsive to that, and there's lots of stories in the media that are like important in terms of highlighting different things about our business that are important to think really deeply about. But I think the more important thing is like whether people actually trust the service itself, which you can actually like, you can see if you release a product and no one uses it, or if you change controls and all of a sudden people start flocking away from the product. And we're really responsive to that type of stuff. I mean, we want people to be really engaged with the service, and that serves as an important accountability mechanism that I think means that if we do something super crappy, people will leave the service, and so we don't do things that I think are crappy, that are out of line with people's expectations about how they want their information used and protected. And so I think that it serves as an important check on our behavior.
Let me ask a question about government relations.
Yeah,
Generally, that function
Yeah.
in the industry.
Yeah.
Maybe Facebook, maybe a competitors. How does, well, first place, what really does government relations mean?
Yeah.
But I'm more interested even in the question of how does government relations, say at Facebook or a similar company, differ, say, when it's happening in DC versus Ankara,
Yeah.
Turkey, or Berlin, where
Right.
you're dealing with different societies, different maybe senses socially and governmentally about what national security is,
Yeah.
what privacy is, what illegal activity really is. Like, how does government relations and the activities at a Facebook-like company differ across these different environments?
Yeah, so my job is global, and global doesn't mean international. Global means that it so if there's an issue at the state level, an issue at the federal level, or an issue internationally, I'm working on it. So global borders are not really like a thing that's of much consideration to me in my job in terms of like whether I would be engaged on a topic. So for like when the purpose of your business is to just operate seamlessly throughout the world, you're focused on, all the boundaries are of less relevance in many ways. I think there is a concern now about whether national governments will impose more regulation on tech companies in a way that will require us to be more boundary oriented in the work that we do. So if there are free expression laws in a particular market, in Brazil, in India, in Germany, in France, that constrain the space for expression and limit what we can have on Facebook, then you're going to get a very different experience of Facebook in Brazil than you would in Germany, than you would in France. And that, at least right now, given where we are as a company, is kind of out of step with what's intended. It is not random that there's only Facebook.com and it's not Facebook.fr or Facebook.br. And so I think that that's something that we're like, very concerned with. I have actually found, in terms of the sort of business of government relations, I think that I've found that it's actually more similar in the different places we operate in than I would have expected, and including more similar with sort of Republicans and Democrats. Like, I think in many ways this is a less political place than I've worked in historically. And I think the reason is the fundamental thing that anchors us as a company is trying to advance our mission. And so that's not like a Republican mission or a Democratic mission. It's not a U.S. mission or an Indian mission. It really is a global mission of trying to make sure that people can connect. And so when you're motivated in that way, you're pushing in the same direction, no matter what the government is. And typically that direction is trying to ensure that the engineers who are in the company can develop the products that they want to develop that will be interesting and exciting and engaging for the world.
But if I understand it, or at least my own experience suggests that Facebook, the Facebook experience in Germany or Turkey, or it is a little different from the Facebook experience here, and the Facebook experience in China isn't an experience.
Right.
But it sounds like Facebook is interested in making it an experience, and there's some kind of negotiation going on, which is partly public. What the public side of it may be false, but it seems like there's some kind of negotiation. So it seems to be the case that Facebook and companies like it are responding to these different national sovereignty issues, some of which we may feel are legitimate concerns.
Right.
There shouldn't be Nazi stuff in Germany.
Yeah.
It's okay. China, there shouldn't be certain kinds of expression. Maybe we're less comfortable, but it seems like a commercial player has to make those decisions. It's not really a global product, right?
Well, we want it to be a global product to the extent it can be, but there are places where people will say, we want more nudity on your platform. So it's really problematic that you have an anti-nudity policy.
Right.
And then there are other places who say even the amount of nudity that is permitted under your terms is objectionable, and so we don't want that content on the service in our country. And we are responsive to local concerns, and that we will geo-block content in a particular market if it's illegal under that law and if it's important that we block it, which means it's unavailable. It might be unavailable in Turkey but is available globally. That's a product, a way that we use the product to sort of try to strike that balance. But I think the general view is that's we certainly want to be respectful of local law where we can be, but that it's not a good thing when expression is constrained.
Can you give me a sense, and totally back out of Facebook, just
the
industry, how do norms operate really, or what's the process by which companies think about this in terms of what they're willing to which laws they're willing to respect and which not, what they're willing to geo-block, what they're not, what they're willing to give up, so like, for example, it doesn't seem that problematic maybe to respond to a FISA warrant. I mean, there's a whole process, a procedure.
Yeah.
Whereas the government's saying, give us a bunch of information because we want to track down who is communicating about Tibet, Tibetan independence. So there's some kind of process that goes on. How does it go on?
Yeah, so we're trying. There are a number of things that you might think would be like corporate bullshit, but it's not bullshit. We actually are really committed to trying to protect our users. We really are. And so if there are governments that are requesting information that we think are going to put lives at risk and are going to really jeopardize the security of the people who use our platform, we push back in those cases. We try to interpret legal requests very narrowly. We try to provide, information only when absolutely necessary. We work with a bunch of others who are concerned about similar issues. So, for instance, we're a member of the Global Network Initiative, which is a coalition of companies, civil society organizations, academics, and investors that are focused on issues of free expression and privacy in the tech space. And we work with them to try to both advocate for laws globally that are consistent with global norms around internet freedom, as well as to ensure that we are implementing the best practices possible to try to advance free expression and respect the privacy of our users. So it's a dance. I mean, there are times where you might be obligated to comply, but we try to push back as much as we possibly can.
Great, fantastic. I want to open it up to you all. I'm sure you have tons of questions. Yeah.
So would Facebook, and do you think other people in the industry, be open to adopting some sort of standardized interchange format for responding to law enforcement subpoenas? And if so, under what circumstances?
So I'm curious. So I'm just what's the benefit of that from your perspective?
The benefit of that is that the law enforcement agencies that are doing the work that they're already doing, and that is already lawful, do it more efficiently and wasting less of their time and wasting less of the provider's time.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I don't think we necessarily... So we want to be responsive to law enforcement requests that are legitimate, meaning that they're consistent with international norms, they're consistent with our terms, they're consistent with local law. We want to be able to provide data in those cases, and certainly there are cases that we can all think of that are where it's desirable to provide data, including in some types of cases where we can't currently. So under US law right now, we're prohibited from providing access to content outside of the mutual legal assistance process. So content means if you and I are exchanging messages, what we're actually saying in those messages as opposed to the metadata, meaning the identifying information for me and you or the timestamps for those messages. So we're prohibited from providing access to the content of those messages. There are lots of pro-human rights reasons for us to disclose content in certain situations. So you can imagine some of those types of situations that you were mentioning where maybe you wouldn't want to disclose data where like there would be someone's targeting political activists and they're looking for data on those activists and they're going to use that data to prosecute that activist or detain or torture them, for instance. We don't want to not provide data in those cases. But you can also imagine there are lots of cases where it's good for human rights to provide data. So a group of people commit gang rape of a woman on a bus in India, for instance. This is the type of, we have these cases. And we are currently unable to provide data in response to a request from the Indian government in that case. We would like to be able to do that. We're working with others in the industry to figure out a mechanism for doing it. But I'm not necessarily sure that in all cases standardization is a helpful thing. I think we want to try to ensure that we can say no in cases that are problematic from a human rights standpoint, and if standardization meant that there was more pressure to say yes in those cases, I think that would be a problematic thing.
Questions over here? Yes, please. Maybe wait for the mic, thanks.
Thank you for coming today, and I have a question about, I see a lot of very talented young people such as yourself that are in private industry, but do you see a brain drain from the policymaker side? In the United States, he's smiling, right? Because are we not seeing our best and the brightest making the policy, but rather in the private industry defending it, or defending against the policy, which may lag behind by months or years, which could be detrimental in cases where technology moves so fast. Do you see the next group of people or the next generation of policymakers having the education, a desire to go into policymaking, and is that going to be a challenge going forward?
Yeah, so I guess I don't see it as quite a dichotomy. Like, I think it's good that there's smart minds in the private sector thinking about the policy implications of their work. Like, I don't wake up thinking, well, if I was on the government side, then I'd be doing good ethical work. But I'm on the private sector side, so I'm doing like shitty work that I should feel bad about. But at least I get a paycheck. Like, that's not how I think about it. I think that the products that we're putting out into the world are good for people. And I think the people at the company who are developing those products are motivated by a desire to do things that are really helpful for people. So one example I've been thinking a lot about recently, the Internet of Things. I don't know if that's a term that you guys all know. So Internet of Things is rollout of more connected technologies in people's homes. And I've been in lots of conversations recently where people have just been dismissive of the development of the Internet of Things, and they said things like, why do you need a sensor on a wine bottle? Or like, oh, it's gonna be so great when my toaster can connect to a Wi-Fi network. I don't need that. And I think that's like a really insane and dismissive way to think about the development of this sector. My sense of like the reason that Uber was introduced is that it was introduced so that you didn't have to show up at a date in a crappy cab. You could show up in a sweet black car and impress your date. It wasn't an issue for me because I show up to most dates on a woman's bike, which is my trusty steed. But for other people, apparently, it was important to show up in a nice car to a date. But at the same time, when Uber was introduced, like, it was pretty tough as a black man in a city to get a cab. And my understanding is that Uber has helped to address that issue. And at the time, policymakers weren't fixing that problem. It was like a joke in late night TV. It was a private company that came in and helped to address that issue. I think that's, like, we're gonna see that in the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is gonna, I assume, will have benefits for like domestic violence, for instance. It might do some crappy things too, and we'll wanna work to mitigate the harms, but it will do a set of good things. So I think that it's really awesome that we have smart, good people working on those technologies, not just on the engineering side, but on the policy side. I haven't experienced, I've been at Facebook for 5.5 years. That's not a long time, but it's not a super, super short time. I work with really smart people in the government. I'm really impressed by them and feel like we have a good working relationship on lots of issues.
Matt, just to press a little bit on that,
Yeah.
I think we all play different roles. We're supposed to play different roles.
Yeah.
So I assume your number one function is not to think about U.S. national security, although of course you're not interested in undercutting. But
Yeah.
So I think there might be a concern that because of whatever the appeal of a job in industry, that there may be a brain drain away from, say, national security agencies. And it's a little bit like the financial regulation analogy. Some people might argue, look, the financial sector has so many resources, they're pulling talent out, and the regulators, they're really smart, but there are not that many of them, and they're always going to be playing catch up. And even though each one is really smart, and the regulators are doing their job, and the financial people are doing their job, they're not evil, there's a problem that develops.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when Jim Comey is testifying in front of Congress and talking about how crappy encryption is and the risks it raises, I don't typically think, thank God for this brain drain into the private sector. I mean, you've got a pretty impressive person making the case on the other side, and I also, I guess I just don't. It doesn't seem to me to be the case that the public sector, either of two things. One is that the public sector is unable to talk about advancing its objectives. I mean, obviously there are challenges in the political process, but I don't think those are due primarily to, people in my line of work. And I also think that people sort of, like in the encryption debate, people said all the time, frequently it was said, it's so crazy that Silicon Valley is making decisions about the types of products that people have available. Government should make those decisions, and maybe that's right. I don't know. Maybe that's right, but maybe it's not right. I mean, it seems to me, again, like if we look at the trend of that issue over the last couple of months, it seems to me like many people in government are realizing the value of encryption from a security standpoint, not even from a privacy standpoint. And then from a privacy standpoint, I think there are other values as well. So it doesn't necessarily seem to me to be the case that it's such a bad world where you have smart people in the corporate sector who are making good decisions about the kinds of services that people have available to them. And again, I think there are lots of reasons why we're incredibly accountable in that process. If we release a crappy product and there are a lot of news stories about it and users start moving away from the product, we tend to react pretty quickly to those dynamics and shift toward a product that is actually more consistent with what people want to see.
Great. Questions? The one in the back, yeah?
Yeah, you elided over this a little earlier, I felt, and if you want to continue to do
Yeah.
so, I understand. But you mentioned international norms as forming one of your bases for how you comply with law
Yeah.
enforcement requests for information.
Yeah.
But as you kind of see jurisdictional, sort of norms of jurisdiction expanding and you're trying to enter China, how do you feel you're going to be able to deal with actions of citizens in other countries than the ones requesting information?
Sorry, what do you mean actions of citizens?
So, you know, a citizen here expressing their rights on Facebook, you get a request, they're a Chinese citizen, getting a request from China for that kind of information,
For access to the user data or to suppress the speech?
for their user data.
Yeah, so typically, we have standards that govern how we respond to foreign jurisdictions' requests for information. So it has to be first consistent with the laws in that jurisdiction. So if it's an Indian government is submitting a request and the under Indian law you're required to get a judge-approved warrant-like instrument, then you would have to comply with that legal process. It also has to apply to users in the jurisdiction, so the Indian government is not able to send us a request and ask for data on Pakistani users. The Pakistani government can send us a request. And then the third prong is it has to be consistent with international norms, and so that's obviously sort of depends on a case-by-case basis. But we look to things like the Global Network Initiative, for instance, has a set of principles on free expression and privacy, and that's the type of thing that we look at when we determine if we would respond to that type of request. But I think the underlying dynamic that you described is accurate in that, like, increasingly governments seek to control what happens on the internet, and that, from our standpoint, is a problematic development. So I don't know if you're familiar with the nonprofit group Freedom House, for instance, but around this time every year, I think it's coming out in the next couple of weeks, they release a Freedom on the Net report, and every year I've been at Facebook, that report has looked worse and worse from year to year, where they're evaluating on a set of objective criteria what's the state of free expression and privacy globally. It's looked worse and worse. We're now increasingly, because of a series of blocks, primarily because of a series of blocks we experienced of WhatsApp, blocking of the WhatsApp service in Brazil, we've now focused a little bit more on trying to understand the blocking phenomenon globally. So when countries shut off access to a particular service or a particular class of services, so like VoIP calling in the Middle East, for instance, is blocked in many jurisdictions there. And the trends in that are all downward too. So Brookings came out with a report a couple weeks ago saying that the economic costs of blocking last year, I think, was around $2.4 billion. The costs in India alone were over $900 million. I don't know if I asked you to guess how many blocks Facebook has had since the start of 2016. I'm actually sort of curious. How many blocks do you think? How many times do you think Facebook has been blocked in 2016?
I couldn't even guess.
Go for it.
5,000.
That's 5,000. That's depressing. That's even more depressing. Yeah. So over 30. Yeah. I'm gonna stop asking that question. People are like, 2 million. No. I think I would have guessed a handful, maybe, and I wouldn't have been able.
What blocks, do you mean national blocks?
So I mean, not necessarily just national. So that's actually part of the troubling development in blocking. So when I started at Facebook in January 2011. I started, I think, the week before Egypt shut off the internet. So 2011, Egypt shut off the internet for 5 days. About like a year ago, I was saying, like, I sort of thought that was gonna like define my experience at the company, and for a little while it did. Like Vietnam sort of blocked us intermittently and stuff, and other countries blocked us every now and then. But then there was a point where I felt like we were experiencing fewer blocks. Since the beginning of 2016, there have been over 30, and some of those blocks are very targeted in duration or in location. So a region in India, for instance, like one state in India will shut down Facebook or shut down the internet because students are taking an exam and they don't want students to cheat using the internet, or that's the allegation. Or there will be protests, or it will be election day in a particular place, and they'll cut off either a service or they'll cut off all internet access. And I think that's troubling because it's, when Egypt shut off the internet, that was front page news. And there were studies that were done afterwards on the economic impact and stuff, and it was really like a major event to shut off all internet access for all services for a 5-day period. I think what happens when you have more targeted blocking is by reducing the cost of every individual block, you actually are able to block more frequently, which increases the global costs of blocking as a phenomenon. So I know I'm impressed by the 5,000 number, but even 30, when you're a company devoted to connecting the world, 30 is intolerable. And I've been in meetings with Mark Zuckerberg where he's like personally, like blocking gets at his heart, right? He has built a service that's focused on connection. Blocking is the opposite of connection. It is a problem. And so I think what we're trying to do is focus a little bit more on this phenomenon as a whole, and actually really try to spur the research community to do more work on this, to highlight the costs overall, even as individual blocks on their own become less costly.
Can I just add, so I'm just thinking about myself as I move whatever around the world occasionally, and I'm using Facebook, and most of my work's in China. I go to China, it's not working, it's really annoying and really obvious, including all the other products that aren't working when I cross that border. But within China, when I'm using Chinese apps, the experience is great.
Yeah.
And so I think the ordinary citizen in a big enough market isn't really feeling these blocks all that significantly. And that's not at all a criticism of Facebook. It's just saying that the reality, particularly for larger markets that are choosing, we're going to exercise sovereignty and we're going to... It's pretty subtle what the experience is like for a number of these consumers.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly blocks that don't have a significant impact on every consumer they impact, but I think if you look at the ways that the internet's used now, I think it's pretty problematic. I mean, people are using it to get access to health information, there are increasing number of education services that are available, people are using it for political reasons, they're using it to consume information. So it might be that being cut off from access to the New York Times for 4 hours is not the end of the world, but I don't think that's a good development. I think that if governments increasingly do it, it will be problematic. Primarily, I think from a human rights standpoint. I mean, I think from a free expression standpoint, it's pretty deeply problematic. And access not just to political and civil rights, but also access to social and economic rights. I also think from a protectionist standpoint, it's pretty problematic as well. I mean, I think, like I was saying in the context of encryption, you want to have an ecosystem that's filled with different apps and services that ranges of people can access for different reasons, and they're the ones making the choice. You don't want governments, I don't think, making choices about what services people can access and what they can't.
Questions? Let's go one over here.
So we keep talking about how the government actively goes to people like Facebook or private industry asking for things, information, but how do you foresee the relationship changing as far as the government teaming with the private sector in more of a consulting fashion, because they're not really that good at technology and they need help?
Yeah, so what do you mean by consulting fashion?
Bigger issues, right? Something like immigration reform. Going to the private sector asking, hey, how could we process a person? Because right now they're trying to design that whole system themselves. And
no, it's a great idea. It sort of goes to the brain drain question, I think, actually. So I don't know that much about this, but you should look into it. There's a thing now called the United States Digital Service, which is focused, I think, on exactly these kinds of issues. And so I think the idea is, can you make technology more a part of the core functions of government? And I think there's a lot of that that's internal facing, like how can you just better operationalize existing internal government systems. I assume that over time there will be more that's external facing too, like, I don't know if any of you have worked for the government, but like when you start working for the government, you fill out like 19 forms and you put your address on each of those forms. I think it's like the most baffling thing. Like why do you have to put your address on 19 different forms? You should write your address once and they know who you are. So I think that there are like ways that probably, it's not just would not just be internal facing, but would also be external facing. And my sense is that they've gotten good employees from the tech sector to do that work. I mean, the current Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the United States, used to be the General Counsel at Twitter, and is someone who I worked with when I first joined Facebook. And I think there's increasingly these positions are desirable for people who are coming out of tech. So I think generally it's actually a positive narrative.
Questions? Yeah, go ahead. Over here next.
So following in a similar vein to these questions and using perhaps the example of like requests for backdoors in products,
Yeah.
how do you handle situations in which it seems like the technology side and the policy side are talking completely different languages?
It's really hard. It's very hard. I think I don't know what you think about this, but I feel like on encryption we've actually done a good job. So I think, it's sort of interesting the way people lined up initially. There was it was government against technologists and companies. And I think over time, I don't know if you've seen the clip of Lindsey Graham where he, day one, he was like, this is crazy, you guys need to provide access to the data. And then he was at a hearing 3 days later where he was like, I looked into this, and it's actually a really hard issue. And I think that is a sign. I think there's been that kind of progress across the government. I think we actually have done a pretty good job of making the case about different elements of the technology and why that has relevance for government, but obviously need to keep doing it.
But that's an issue too that got a lot of popular coverage, and I think social pressure sort of fed into people looking deeper into the issue.
Yeah.
Well, are there instances where maybe there's not that much public care about the issue, and you kind of just get bulldozed over by requests that you might not be able to have the time to?
So I don't know if we
educate on?
go bulldoze over by requests we just wake up one day and there's a back door.
Yeah.
To write in.
Well, I think that would be a
right.
particularly significant one,
Right.
yeah.
But I think on all this stuff it's really important. I mean, my job is to address the issue that you just said. My job is to help translate what the engineers are doing. I'm not an engineer. We're not a policy company. We're an engineering company. I'm not an engineer. My job is to translate what engineers do and to make it relevant for policymakers and to come up with ways to articulate arguments about our products and services that make sense to them, which I think they typically do. I was thinking, well, maybe that makes it sound like I'm spinning crap into gold or something, and that's not how it feels to me. I think it is about trying to ensure that there's a good runway for products that have a lot of value. So one example actually of a thing that I've been thinking a lot about recently is artificial intelligence. So there's been a lot of discussion. There are a couple of different weird strains of the public debate about artificial intelligence. I think the weirdest is that robots are going to kill us one, which is pretty prominent for any of you who follow the debate. One of the other ones is that that artificial intelligence is going to take away our jobs. So that's been very prevalent. I don't think there's been a ton in the media pushing back on that. And then I was at a conference a couple of months ago where people were talking about this, what's the impact of artificial intelligence and more automation on labor markets. And it was a really dour presentation, and I went up to one of the economists afterward and I was like, so this sounds pretty bad, but what about, is protecting certain industries now because of a concern about development of technology? How would you think about protection of the railroad industry as the car industry was emerging, right? You could have imagined a bunch of people saying, we gotta worry about this car industry because we've got all these great railroad jobs. And obviously that would be a bad thing for innovation and for the economic development of the country. So I sort of said, isn't the same thing probably true for artificial intelligence? Do we really want to be protectionist about existing sectors of the economy because of this concern about automation and artificial intelligence to come? And the economist said, yeah. What do you, why are you even asking me? Of course we want to be concerned about protectionism. And I was like, well, a policymaker who watches your presentation is going to think, how can we get in the way of the innovation that's happening in this sector? And he was like, no, we don't want to get in the way of globalization. We don't want to get in the way of economic transformation. And in fact, we actually want to accelerate that process. So there's going to be pain probably as we transform the economy in different ways, but there will be good outcomes overall. And the question is, how can we manage the pain or support people who are experiencing the pain in the short run, and then also promote a set of policies that push us toward more economic nimbleness so that transition is as quick as possible. That's a very different policy roadmap than, oh my God, we need to stop artificial intelligence because it's going to kill all of us or it's going to kill all of our jobs. And so what I try to do is like understand those dynamics and then help to translate them for policymakers.
Thanks.
I think there was a question. Let's go to the back.
Do you believe then that artificial intelligence does not have the potential to permanently increase unemployment in a way that automotive jobs replacing railroad jobs did not?
I don't know. What do you think? I mean, I think definitively, I mean, a lot of the stuff in our job is don't regulate before you identify a harm. And I think that it's possible that artificial intelligence is going to be the best thing ever for employment. I don't know. Do you know that that's not the case?
I'm no economic expert, but I'm inclined to believe that artificial intelligence, by replacing certain human job functions, will not similarly create other job functions in equal proportion, the way that railroads, hey, those sort of disappeared, but we have like all the jobs making cars.
Yeah, so I'm seeing nods. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. ATMs didn't kill the bank teller industry, right? So it's like conceivable that that's not the case. And I guess if it's possible that artificial intelligence is going to spur innovation that's going to lead to more economic opportunity, why would you regulate it now? Because people are inclined to believe a set of things about how it might unfold. And if there were evidence that artificial intelligence was going to kill jobs or was going to kill people, then maybe we want to think about that technology in a different way. My instinct right now is that we don't know that that's the case and that the counterfactual could be true. And if that's the case, then I would think it's an area that we'd want to restrain innovation. That doesn't mean, again, don't ever regulate, but I think it means it probably is premature right now.
So for the time being, laissez-faire?
As opposed to kill the industry? Yeah.
Thank you.
Tony.
Maybe this is an unfair stretching of the discussion, but on the other side of surveillance, one might argue that there's taste formation. And I know there have been a number of accusations or charges that Facebook is manipulating the algorithms which determine what kinds of information gets shown and how it's ranked. And I mean, you know, we're living in a moment where those kinds of things, I mean, if Hillary Clinton wasn't, if some other candidate was running, the manipulation of taste might make a difference in an election. The Russian hacking could have done something. So I'm just interested in what you think about the company's abilities to manipulate taste and political perspective, if to the degree that the algorithms are not transparent.
Yeah, so I think we're pretty transparent about what we're trying to do with the algorithm. I mean, the purpose of the algorithm is to surface relevant content to people. So that's what it's designed to do, and that's how we evaluate its success. There have been studies that show that like there's a sort of a discrepancy between the information that people are exposed to on the platform, which in many ways is broadening, versus the information that they actually select to read, which in some ways is, you know, the information that's more consistent with their worldview. It's a little bit hard for me to believe that a world where we have like 3 television networks and 4 major newspapers is more information diverse than the world that we have currently. And that even in a world where algorithms are showing you information that's consistent with, is designed to be information that you would find to be interesting or that you would click on and engage with, but you still have the ability to go to lots of different types of information. You still have, actually, most friend networks tend to be diverse, so you actually are exposed to diverse viewpoints, that we're not in a world that's significantly more diverse overall than the world that we have been in. I don't know, you look skeptical.
Well, I mean, we're living more and more in internet bubbles, and the shapes of those bubbles seem to be open to, can be shaped by the algorithms, right? And how much the
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so how does that compare to the New York Times bubble?
How does that compare to the New York Times bubble? Just maybe in mass.
Well, so I mean, my I don't know what your experience is with your news feed. My experience in my news feed is that I get, I think, probably more information than if I bought one particular newspaper,
Sure.
or if I watched one particular television network, or if I went to one particular news site. So it's not, I mean, it's not designed, again, it's designed to surface information to you that's relevant. It's not designed to surface to you the maximum diverse information possible. So there is, I don't want to pretend that it's like only expansive, because I don't think that's an accurate reflection of what the product is, but I do think in many ways relative to other means of accessing news that it provides you with diverse information in a way that's compelling. I also think the interesting thing, like, so I feel like, so I operate in a world of trade-offs, right? So where they're like real decision, where like you're making a decision between a couple of different directions to go in. So I don't know exactly what so if we just made you the decision maker now, and we said, we're gonna make a set of decisions that are gonna be consistent with, that are gonna be responsive to your concern. I mean, maybe this is too extreme, but it feels to me like we're looking at worlds where you're coding every piece of content according to some place that it sits on across the political spectrum. And then we are deciding to surface information to you in certain buckets. So we're saying like, here's 20% of your newsfeed is gonna be left of center content, 40% of your newsfeed is gonna be right of center content. This percentage of your newsfeed is gonna be content that, you know, foreign leftist content. And I just don't, like, that doesn't seem to me to be a good world.
No, I don't.
Maybe just let me
Yeah.
ask, I think a variant of this. So the point that the information we receive
Yeah.
is almost always filtered and edited,
Yeah.
and curated. And I get that.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Like when I read the New York Times, there's some editor who's made decisions, and I think for most of us, if we know about a particular thing, then articles like, think, what is this crap, or how could you not, put that in there? But all right, so that's filtered. But when I'm now using Google,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm getting, I'm doing a search, and I'm getting a bunch of things that are now showing up in part because somebody's paid.
Yeah.
Like it's a little different. The New York Times isn't saying we'll sell space to on our front page to whoever wants to pay it. Whoever pays us more,
that's their advertising
you
model,
get.
isn't it?
That's the advertising, but that's not the. They're not selling space
Well, I
for
don't
the
think
content.
I don't know Google exactly how the search
And
works, but I don't think Google search works that way. I think if you type Fox News,
it's very
I don't think
hard.
you get.
It's increasingly hard, at least for me.
Yeah.
Like maybe a
Yeah.
bad user of Google,
Yeah.
to distinguish what's an ad from what's just a return on a search. Like those
Yeah.
boundaries are becoming much blurrier.
Yeah,
and
but they're
so-
labeled. It's labeled, right?
I think much
Yeah.
less clearly than it used to be.
Yeah.
And
I
so
think
if
that's
so
right.
that's
Yeah.
where it's a little bit
Yeah.
different. Nothing to do with Facebook, but and so like just to continue this set of like
Yeah.
blurry things in my own interactions with certain parts of the Chinese media, definitely it's straightforward. You want your thing covered on the front page, you pay. Not talking
Yeah.
about state like political stuff, but commercial things. You want your company covered, you pay. And so this kind of idea of mixing in the commercial with a filter, it may be all right for certain things, but when we're using a search engine, maybe the answer is I shouldn't be using a commercial search engine. I'd rather use a nonprofit. I wish there were a Wikipedia version of search so that I don't have to wonder where the blur is between the commercial
Yeah.
list and the.
Yeah, no, it's an
Just
interesting idea. I mean,
straightforward
I can't speak for Google. On Facebook, you can toggle between, like there's like a most relevant versus most recent stories thing that you can toggle between. So most recent is more just like the actual stream of information. I think most people tend not to use that as frequently, in part because it's less relevant,
Yeah.
which is a reflection of the fact that the algorithm is designed to surface more relevant stuff to you. I mean, I think in terms of the line between ads and non-ads, I mean, I don't think we're trying to be misleading about it. And my experience using Facebook is like we delineate pretty clearly when you're seeing something that's sponsored. I think like you can ask the question across a range of different technological developments, right? So like people think now that citizen videos, they interpret those as news and they interpret those as like the real story. And I don't think that's the whole story. It may be in certain circumstances, but it's a little bit hard to determine from, 40 seconds of a video of someone being arrested, like what is the full context. I think it's a helpful data point. I think those things are helpful data points, but I think it's important to evaluate them with the right amount of context.
Yeah. Great. There was a question here. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, I just actually wanted to follow up on a question that Director Steinfeld asked earlier about Geophedia. I've been following that because I work in Baltimore, and I noticed in the ACLU report that, at least according to them, Facebook, alongside other companies, doesn't have any public policy that prohibits developers from using user data for surveillance purposes, even though, you know, even given Facebook's commitment to freedom of speech and to equity. I mean, Geophedia has been used in some pretty racist ways, so I was wondering what
Right,
you
so
think about that.
so like I said, like the racist ways, to the extent that those are illegal ways, then that would be prohibited under existing law, right? We also do, you know, we shut down Geophedia, we shut it down because it was packaging that information and then reselling it for surveillance purposes, and so we shut it down. But again, I mean, I sort of think it's important to be cognizant of how data can be used if you're putting it out into the world publicly. So I think we sort of have the right, I think between like the law and then our policies on how people are permitted to access and use data, and then permitting people to have the choice about how they share information and who they share it with, it feels to me like we strike the right balance. I mean, maybe that sort of goes back to the prior question that you asked where you said, you know, you were sort of implying, is it a little bit too much to put all the burden on people to make decisions that are in their best interests? And I think we want to be a little bit careful about being overly paternalistic in response to that concern. But there are things that check user behavior, right? So like our policies do in some circumstances, as they did here, as well as existing local law would check what, you know, a third party or a government could do with that information.
Yes, your
Thanks for doing this today and sharing your thoughts with us. I'd love to job shadow you. I'm a student here at Brown, so if you're open for job shadowing, I'd love to job shadow you. But
Sounds fun.
yeah, probably won't happen. So instead, could you paint a picture for us? What would it look like the next time you go from, say, 35 blocks to 36? Do you get a call in the middle of the night? How do you find out about it? How do you respond? If you could paint a picture for that.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I love that question. I don't think I have an answer that does the question justice. I mean, it depends. It depends. So some of it is the Brazil stuff that we dealt with is pretty high profile. Some of the other stuff is pretty hard to detect, actually. So the Brazil stuff was like freight train coming at us, and that was very high level meetings in the company. It was the legal team trying to act very quickly to look at judicial processes that we could use to get us unblocked, which actually ultimately was the mechanism that resulted in us being unblocked. We have strong networks in civil society and with government to try to make clear to them what's going on. I mean, often, obviously, other organizations aren't aware of what's happening, and so we try to make them aware really quickly. I think the body of, this is a little bit less in the rapid response part of it, but the body of research that we're doing, I think is gonna be really helpful, just in terms of making people aware of the blocking phenomenon, so that when we point to it in individual circumstances, people see it as part of a problematic development overall, as opposed to some random one-off that they don't really care about. And so there's a lot of outreach to local organizations. There's the judicial stuff. We're obviously doing communications work, so responding to media organizations, for instance, who are interested in it. I think that's kind of the main set of things. Do you think there are other things we should be doing?
No, I was curious about the reactive, then I was curious, is there anything proactive? Like
Yeah.
you suggested maybe people could research it.
Yeah.
What would be better a year from now than it is today?
Yeah, so I think being able to say that these things are costly as a phenomenon, even when they're not necessarily costly in terms of individual incidents, I think is pretty powerful. And I think the function of naming and shaming is that now when there are blocks, people will see it as associated with this bad development that's happening globally, as opposed to just like what a random government is doing. And I think that that's actually really helpful. The blocking stuff is interesting for me because it's a little bit, do you guys know who Ed Visor was? This is a good moment to tell this joke. So Ed Visor was a political science professor here who died a few years ago. And he taught this class called Hard Choices, which was amazing. And I took it my freshman year, and he, one of the recurrent themes in the class was a joke, which I'll butcher. It's not really a joke, it's like a joke for lawyers. And so the joke was basically like, batter hits a ball goes to shortstop throws it to first base, there's a bang bang play, and the question is the runner out? and there are 3 umpires. I'm sorry, I'm butchering the joke, but there are 3 umpires. The first umpire says, he says he was out because he was out. And the second umpire says, what is the second umpire say? I'm sorry, advisor. The third umpire says there wasn't anything until I called it. That was the quote unquote punchline. So like there's no safer out until the judge is saying the thing. And there's a little bit of how that feels. It was like objective, subjective, and then the third was there's nothing until I called it. And that's a little bit of how the blocking stuff has felt to me. Like it was a void. And then we have started working on it, and now it's like a thing that people can identify. And that's giving us a little too much credit. Like it wasn't like people weren't aware of internet blocking. But even the research that Brookings published came out a couple of weeks ago, and even in that time, people are now saying like, that thing is a thing. And that's, I think, really important. It's like it feels to me that it's really helpful to be able to call, to be able to identify something as a trend. And then when there are new incidents, being able to link back to that, I think that's like kind of a part of the advocacy spectrum that maybe other people experience earlier on in their advocacy work. And for me, it's kind of felt novel, like it's a new thing to be able to call it.
I think maybe that was when I said earlier that in big enough markets like China, when there are enough competitors that are delivering really good products that play by those kinds of rules, it doesn't feel like such a big thing. You know,
to be able to say it's a block.
The block doesn't.
No,
fit.
so
I'm not advocating for the block, but
that's a good.
you know
that's a
I mean?
good
Like,
point. But
if there are enough competitors who will play by somebody else's rules.
To me, it's like, this is probably not a good analogy, but it's almost just like you're bedside with someone who's dying of cancer, and you don't know what it's called, but you watch the person dying, and you know it's problematic, but like it's one person. That's different from like a cancer epidemic is killing people throughout the country, and that's kind of how it feels to me. It's like people had I think it's pretty shitty if you want to use a service and you try to use it and you can't because your government has decided that between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. you're not going to be able to access the internet. That's crappy. But that's really different, I think, than this is a global phenomenon that's happening with increasing frequency. I think the number in the Brookings report is like 19 countries and over 80 incidents or something like that, $2.4 billion of costs. That's like to think of the phenomenon is very different. And so I actually sort of wonder, I mean, I'd be interested to hear if there is more sort of public discussion of this issue, if it changes the dynamic in China, because the dynamic is less, our government does this individual thing, and more, this is part of a global trend that is actually a trend we'd rather not be a part of. I'm guessing no.
Yeah. Tim.
Yeah, so I guess my question is just a little bit, you talked about, thank you, you talked a lot about Facebook as sort of a global company serving many different countries. And yet when I went to Europe, I definitely got a sense of a resentment of the kind of American presence, the American domination in their view of the tech services industry. And just one question I have for you, I guess, it goes to data localization.
Yeah, good.
And you know, you gave the example of the Indian rape case. There's also the Schrems decision from Europe, where Facebook has the data. In order to give the data, yes, you have this internal process for deciding whether to comply, but you also have to deal with American law. You mentioned that, if it's content, you can't disclose it. So I guess I have sort of a specific question and then a more general question. My specific question is, I mean, your data is not actually all in California, right? I mean, your data is other places. Do you have to comply with, if you get a request, do you always have to comply with US law when it comes to MLATs and so forth to release content, even if the data is not actually in California because you're a California corporation? That's my very specific question. My second question is just, how do you feel about that? I mean, do you feel that the US does have this kind of special presence globally because they're hosting Facebook? Whether you think of yourselves as global or not, you're a California company and you're sort of being hosted by this country.
Yeah, no, those are both really good questions. So maybe the second first. So I think the answer is yes. I mean, that's how the tech industry has developed. But it's not always good to, I would say that's not an optimal way, I don't think, for us to think about our service, and is typically not how we think about our service. So after the Snowden revelations, President Obama said something like, "Don't worry about it. This is just people outside the U.S." That was incredibly unhelpful for us because more than 80% of our user base is outside the U.S. So the just outside the U.S. is not helpful for us when we're trying to compete globally and try to ensure that our users throughout the world trust us. So that was a problematic thing. And I think even though we are certainly a U.S. company and U.S. legal regime has a certain prominence in the tech space because of where most of the companies are based, I don't think discussing it in those terms or thinking about it in those terms is helpful. And one example of that is if you look at our transparency report where we publish information on the amount of requests that we receive to remove content, not pursuant to our terms, but pursuant to local law. We also detail the number of requests we receive for user data in cases where we respond. If your second question, if that were totally true, that report would be really easy because it would just be zeros outside the U.S., and that's not the case. So you can look at the report and see how we're responsive to foreign jurisdictions there. In response to your first question, it's a good question. I find the discussion about data localization to be very kind of bizarre. So I don't know if that's a term. Is that a term most people know? Data localization. So the idea of data localization, there's sort of different forms of it. One is you got to store the data of our citizens in our country. The other version of it is you have to store the data of our citizens only in our country, meaning you can't have records of our citizens outside of the country. It's basically, I actually can't tell you the answer to whether it's possible for us to truly localize, because if you think about the structure of a social network, it sort of looks like this, and so it's a little hard to go like this when you're a social network. So I couldn't really tell you, like if someone comments on a photo that you've posted and the commenter is in one jurisdiction and the person who posted the photo is in another, where does the data get stored and how do you think about that? I mean, you could apply different, you could just like come up with a rule and then implement that rule, but I'm not sure it's a little hard to go like this. So I'm not sure it's technically feasible, and it doesn't seem to me to be desirable. So I think it's certainly the case that data, if you're concerned about US surveillance, then as our president said, for data outside the US, it's typically is subject to fewer protections than if it were subject to, if it were based in the US. So I'm not sure it's helpful for us to store, I'm not sure it's helpful to privacy in Germany, for instance, for us to store German citizen data in Germany. And I also think typically, like one of the interesting developments since Snowden is, if you ask me like right after Snowden happened, is it likely, I mean, there was major revelations about activity of the US government and in terms of a breadth of surveillance that people weren't aware of. And if you said, okay, in a year, is the scope of surveillance globally going to increase or decrease? I think I would have said it's going to decrease. And I don't think that that's the case. I mean, I think what has happened since Snowden is more governments have wanted access to data held by tech companies. And even though the USA Freedom Act certainly constrained the scope of surveillance in certain ways, I don't think people would say it sort of revolutionized the scope of surveillance. So I think generally, again, the trend is downward, and it's a little bizarre that that's happened in response, that's the state of things after the revelations. And I think that suggests that if data were stored abroad, it is framed in the guise of privacy. I'm not sure if what happens is actually more privacy as a result. It seems to me what's likely to happen is more foreign government access to data that they might have trouble accessing today.
Great. I know there are a lot more questions, but alas, Matt, we've kind of come to the end of our time. But I really want to thank you for being so frank and open and just being willing to come back and educate us.
It's a pleasure.
Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all for attending today.